Welcome to Divine Truth Revealed. I'm Henry. Tonight we are entering one of the most controversial and psychologically disturbing stories in the entire book of Genesis, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. For thousands of years, these cities have been remembered as symbols of judgment. But beneath the surface of the story is something much deeper, a pattern, a warning, a study of how civilizations collapse from within long before they collapse outwardly. Because according to Genesis, the destruction did not begin with fire. It began with moral erosion, slowly, quietly, gradually enough that the people living inside it no longer recognized the change happening around them. And that raises a difficult question. How does an entire society drift so far from stability that collapse becomes irreversible? Because this may not only be an ancient story, it may be a recurring human pattern. These cities were not poor, they were not isolated, and they were not weak. Genesis describes the region surrounding them as fertile and well-watered. Economically, they were positioned for growth. Trade moved through the area. Resources were abundant. From the outside, these cities appeared successful, stable, advanced, functional. And this is important because civilizations rarely collapse at the moment they appear weakest. Many collapse while appearing strongest. History shows this repeatedly. The surface can look prosperous while the internal structure quietly deteriorates. And often, material success hides moral instability, because prosperity can create the illusion that everything is functioning correctly, even when foundational values are eroding underneath. That is where the danger begins, not in visible chaos, but in normalized imbalance. Before destruction ever arrives, Genesis introduces another detail that is often overlooked. Abraham becomes aware that something is deeply wrong within these cities, and what follows is one of the most psychologically significant conversations in the Old Testament. Abraham asks a question that still matters today. Would an entire city be destroyed if righteous people still remained within it? The discussion becomes a search for moral stability. If even a small number of righteous individuals remained, could the civilization still survive? Notice what this implies. The survival of a society is not only tied to economics, military power, or political systems, it is tied to moral structure, to the presence of people still capable of resisting corruption. Because once corruption becomes total, self-correction disappears. And according to the Genesis narrative, that is exactly what had happened. Then the story shifts. Two messengers arrive in Sodom, and immediately, the city reveals itself. Not through appearance, but through reaction. Lot welcomes the visitors into his home, but the surrounding population responds with aggression and hostility. And this moment is critical psychologically, because civilizations reveal their condition through how they treat vulnerability, boundaries, and restraint. What we are witnessing is not simply isolated misconduct, it is collective normalization. The behavior is public, unchallenged, open. The culture no longer recognizes its own instability, and this is one of the clearest signs of moral collapse. When destructive behavior no longer hides itself, because once a society loses the ability to feel conviction, it also loses the ability to correct direction, and eventually, corruption becomes defended rather than questioned. Here is what most people misunderstand about societal collapse. Collapse is rarely sudden, it is cumulative. It happens through repeated compromise over time, small shifts, repeated exposure, gradual desensitization, until eventually, behaviors once recognized as destructive begin to feel ordinary. This is one of the most powerful psychological processes in human behavior, normalization. Human beings adapt to repeated exposure incredibly quickly. What once shocked people eventually becomes familiar. What becomes familiar begins to feel acceptable, and what becomes acceptable eventually becomes protected. This is how cultures drift, not through one decision, but through thousands of small permissions granted over time. And eventually, society reaches a dangerous threshold, the point where it can no longer identify its own dysfunction clearly. At that stage, correction becomes extremely difficult, because people defend the very systems harming them. Example 1. Personal desensitization. This happens on an individual level constantly. A person may initially feel discomfort around dishonesty, exploitation, manipulation, or harmful behavior, but repeated exposure changes emotional response. Over time, the reaction weakens, not necessarily because the person agrees with the behavior, but because the mind adapts to repetition. And eventually, what once triggered conviction produces no reaction at all. The conscience becomes quieter through repeated exposure. Example 2. Cultural drift. The same process happens collectively. Entire societies can gradually redefine what is considered normal, and usually the shift is subtle enough that people inside the culture barely notice it happening. Language changes, standards change, expectations change, and eventually behaviors once considered destabilizing become socially reinforced, not because they were deeply examined, but because they became common. And once repetition takes hold, questioning the direction itself becomes uncomfortable. The deeper warning of Sodom is not simply immorality, it is unrestrained moral drift, a society losing the ability to self-correct, because every civilization depends on limits, boundaries, restraint, accountability. Without those things, power expands without direction, and eventually, systems begin consuming themselves internally. History demonstrates this repeatedly. Civilizations often fall long before the official collapse appears. The internal decay starts first. Trust erodes, meaning erodes, shared standards erode, and eventually the structure becomes unstable enough that collapse becomes unavoidable. This is why Genesis presents destruction not as random anger, but as consequence. The civilization had reached a condition where restoration no longer appeared possible. Now step into the modern world. Because this pattern did not disappear. Today, humanity is more connected than at any point in history. Technology, media, artificial intelligence, global communication, mass influence at scale. Never before have ideas moved this quickly. And with that speed comes accelerated normalization. A behavior, ideology, or mindset can spread globally in days, not through deep examination, repetition, and this creates a serious psychological effect. People begin accepting familiarity as truth. Visibility becomes mistaken for legitimacy, and repeated exposure creates emotional acceptance long before intellectual understanding catches up. Example 1. Social media acceleration. Consider social media platforms. TikTok, Instagram, X, algorithms reward visibility and emotional intensity. Not necessarily wisdom, not necessarily truth. The more something is repeated, the more psychologically familiar it becomes. And familiarity reduces resistance. Eventually, people stop evaluating whether something is healthy, accurate, or stable. They only evaluate whether it is popular. This creates an environment where trends shape perception faster than reflection can keep up. And over time, entire cultural norms can shift rapidly. Example 2. Institutional drift. Now consider large institutions, corporations, entertainment systems, media organizations. Cultural change inside institutions usually does not happen suddenly. It happens gradually, one compromise at a time. One exception becomes acceptable. One adjustment becomes permanent. And after years of gradual drift, the institution no longer resembles its original structure. But because the change happened slowly, most people cannot identify the exact moment the transformation occurred. And this is exactly how normalization works, quietly, incrementally, without immediate resistance. Then comes one of the most symbolic moments in the story. Lot and his family are told to leave the city behind, and they are given one instruction: do not look back. But Lot's wife turns and looks anyway, and instantly she becomes frozen in place. For centuries, people have debated this moment literally, but psychologically it carries another meaning as well. Human beings struggle to detach from environments they adapted to. Even unhealthy systems become emotionally familiar. People can recognize dysfunction intellectually while still remaining psychologically attached to it. Because familiarity creates emotional gravity, and leaving behind a destructive environment often means leaving behind identity, comfort, routine, and attachment. That is why transformation is difficult, not because people cannot see the problem, but because they became connected to it over time. Eventually, the destruction arrives. Fire descends upon the cities, and Sodom and Gomorrah disappear from history as functioning civilizations. But the deeper point of the story is not spectacle, it is trajectory. Genesis presents collapse as the end result of unchecked direction over time. A civilization repeatedly choosing normalization over correction, convenience over accountability, power without restraint, and eventually the consequences become irreversible, because every system eventually reveals what it truly values. Every culture eventually exposes the direction it has been moving toward all along, and no civilization escapes consequence forever.